Hello internet, Taliesin here, and welcome to the new place. Sorry it's not all completely ready and it's a little bit echoey. That shouldn't last long, I promise. But welcome to a type of video that we haven't done for a few months now. Welcome to a World of Warcraft cinematic analysis, because we now have a release date for Shadowlands. I was right, it's no big deal. And gotten a proper eyeful of the first in a series of new Afterlives cinematics, which are going to be released weekly to build hype for that expansion release. And you know what, internet? This may surprise you, but it totally worked. Consider me hyped, because this first installment, Bastion, is just the kind of high-quality scene-setting fare that you'd expect, chock full of little details and references and callbacks that we love to spot, and it's full of some really tasty lore revelations, which are not just super interesting anyway, but which also open up the speculation floodgates on what is actually going on in Shadowlands. Let the speculation gush. Basically what I'm saying is it is the perfect cinematic to see us back into these videos, and just in case you're new here, a quick disclaimer about these videos. This is not a reaction, okay? I've watched this cinematic loads of times over the past couple of days, and we are going to be deep diving into the minutiae of it, which means this is also a really terrible way of watching the cinematic if you haven't already seen it, because we are going to be stopping and starting and skipping bits and talking over bits and sometimes doing bits in the wrong order, and generally just having a grand old nerdy time with it. So join us as we look at Afterlives Episode 1 Bastion and ask, what's missing from Uther's soul? Will we be saving Arthas? And did the good guys just do exactly what the jailer wanted all along? Okay, go, 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 go. So yeah, I told you we'd be stopping a lot. We begin with this opening, introducing our main character to the scene, Uther, the Lightbringer. Obviously a legendary and instantly recognizable character in Warcraft lore, from Warcraft 3 all the way through Wrath of the Lich King, Hearthstone, and most recently Legion 2. And actually, just before we get into this, it's worth pointing out that this cinematic is directed by another name that you've probably all heard of, Teran Gregory, who kind of embodies the entire WoW cinematics team for most players these days. And despite being the most well-known of all those incredibly talented names, this Bastion Afterlives is the first non-CGI cinematic that Teran has directed in his entire time at Blizzard, and you'd imagine it was probably a gig that he really wanted to, because if you hunt down Teran's in-game NPC in Stormwind Cathedral Square, he and his wife Diva are diligently paying homage at the memorial to Uther the Lightbringer. So it's very fitting that he takes charge of this piece, and fair to say that you'd expect the character of Uther to be in safe hands here. So this opening has the eerie silence and still of the world obnoxiously pierced by the crashing thud of metal as Uther drops his famous hammer and sinks to his knees, but the quiet remains as a very important part of this opening, mostly so that we can focus on one sound, the sound of Uther's breathing. Strained, difficult, and heavy. There's a lot of emphasis on weight in this Azerothian opening, and we'll see why in a moment. And of course, the focus on Uther's breathing is because these are his last breaths before his life is ended and we head to the Shadowlands, where, you know, breathing's not really a thing. And as his bowed in defeat head rises one last time, his eyes open and stare defiantly at his opponent. Eyes being so incredibly important throughout this entire cinematic, as we'll also see. And this is a great example, because obviously we've had these kind of animated series in the build-up to WoD, Legion, and BFA, and they have all been brilliant, but I think in terms of pure artwork and how the characters and emotions of the players are conveyed through basically still images, I think this first Afterlives might actually be the best of the lot so far. The humanity, disappointment, hurt, and anger in Uther's eyes here, obvious even to someone who has no idea what's going on, before we are shown the person responsible for all of this. Arthas Menethil. And we're going to speak a lot about Arthas later, but we see him here from Uther's point of view, towering above his defeated foe, coldly emotionless with his inhuman, piercing, unnaturally blue eyes, in direct contrast to the relatable humanity of Uther's staring down. And I love this slow-paced, ominous steps forward from Arthas here. It reminds me of the footsteps that opened the Jaina Warbringer a couple of years ago. As she made her way to symbolically pay the boatman to ferry her to the afterlife, Arthas' steps lead him towards sending Uther that way instead. And this wide shot is super powerful too, because by now, if you remember Warcraft 3, then you know exactly what's going on. This is Arthas slaying Uther outside Arendelle. And the contrast between the exposed, undefended human town on the left of the frame with the hulking, fleshy, spiky masses of the Scourge on the right highlights the helplessness of Uther's situation here. Also note the golden colour palette, something we saw in the Sylvanas Warbringer in Silvermoon, where yes, she was killed by Arthas, the warmth of the living world used to contrast starkly with the cold, dead blues associated with Arthas and Frostmourne. Of course, the gold here has an almost toxic tint to it too, as the Scourge spread their noxious diseases everywhere they go. Also, and this isn't so important, but there's Arthas' horse invincible here too, which is weird because if he's invincible, how can I see him? And that heavy metallic sound cuts through the quiet again as Frostmourne is drawn to finish the job. This whole opening, of course, recreates Uther's death at the hands of Arthas in Warcraft 3, where there's actually dialogue, which it could be relevant to look at.
I dearly hope that there's a special place in hell waiting for you, Arthas.
We may never know, Uther. I intend to live forever.
I truly hope there is a special place in hell waiting for you, Arthas. What we have thought for years were Uther's last words, but here we learn different.
Light, save my soul.
Because as those cold Frostmourne runes glow just like Arthas' eyes, and Uther closes his in readiness, the blade plunges and all goes dark for our hero. The last thing to fade being those runes burned into his consciousness, and as we will see, the memory of this moment really is seared into Uther's very being, and we hear his actual last words, whether they be actually spoken or not, a whispered prayer to the light to save his soul, which it turns out might have worked. And yes, I know this video is already pretty long and we've only talked about the opening 30 seconds, but this opening is so important because it tells you so much about this cinematic's purpose and what it means for the Shadowlands, because it kind of does what Shadowlands the expansion does. It reminds us of a famous and world-shaping moment from the past, reveals something new about it that we didn't know before, and then shows us how that famous event has shaped our present, or I guess even our future in the Shadowlands, which we are about to explore. So it would be easy to be quite cynical and read this as kind of like nostalgia, in case of emergency, break glass, release Arthas. But that would be to miss the point, because it all comes together to set the scene for the very real and relevant events that we will end up in the middle of for the coming expansion, as we will see, because the hopeless muted sounds of that opening then give way to literally choirs of angels.
Uther.
Where am I?
Welcome to Bastion.
And the cold blue of death and undeath is replaced by the bright warm blue of a summer sky and Elysian Hold, a place we will go to quite early on in our gameplay journey in Shadowlands, comes into view out of the clouds, and it basically couldn't be more different from the very emphasized weight and heaviness of the living world that we just saw. Here, castles literally float on clouds, and Uther lifts his head once more, not to face the end of his life, but to see the beginning of the rest of his time, and we are introduced to Bastion. Also, I love that Devos is carrying Uther here in much the same way as you, the player, will spend getting carried around by Kyrion all throughout the Bastion zone. It just makes me chuckle.
You led a truly selfless life, and for that, you have been chosen.
Chosen?
To shed your mortal burdens and join the ranks of the Ascended.
And the contrast between how Uther slumps, kneeled in front of Devos, compared to how he did the same against Arthas is obvious. Whereas the future Lich King was overbearing and oppressive, here we see the towers and denizens of Bastion from below too, but this time it's to emphasize the freedom of how the structures and inhabitants soar upwards. And look, if you've just seen what Uther has seen and gone through what he has just experienced, just been brutally betrayed and murdered by your own beloved student, and then this happens with an actual angel telling you how awesome and special and selfless you are and how you're in heaven now, you'd be pretty pleased about that, right?
I serve the light, and my work is not done. There is an evil that must be...
There is no evil here.
Well, not Uther, who is still showing a rather stubborn commitment to the wrongs that he just faced on Azeroth, which is okay. It's nothing Devos hasn't seen before. Your path in Bastion is all about unburdening yourself of that worldly pain to become a fully fledged Kyrion after all. But it's interesting how unmoved Uther is upon learning that, you know, heaven exists and he's in it.
The darkness was sealed within the maw long ago.
You're wrong. He destroyed my home, murdered my people and my king. He must be punished.
We also learned the important plot point from Devos that there is no evil here. It's all sealed away within the Moor, whatever that is. And also, and look, we can't ignore this, Uther is very blue now. He is Bluther, both literally and metaphorically. And we get to see into his eyes once again, steeled and determined that he doesn't care about any of this lovely heaven shit. He wants what he calls justice.
You are an aspirant now. You must accept your new purpose and purge yourself of this desire for vengeance.
What I desire is justice.
But what Devos has already correctly identified is actually a desire for vengeance within him. And lots of you will be disagreeing with that right now, but you're wrong, because years later in the Bastion questing, Uther admits to us that it was actually vengeance. We then flash forward to Bluther being very blue in a heavenly, idyllic field of wheat, and I adore this shot and its composition.
Devos, why are you training this soul? It is beneath your station as a paragon.
Because just look how peaceful and lovely this place is. It's actual heaven, and Uther's hang-up about revenge is rendering him totally unable to appreciate that he's in actual heaven, though. The way both characters have their back to us is emphasizing Devos' beautiful white angelic wings and Uther's complete lack of them. He has made no progress on his aspirant journey so far. As Devos says,
He cannot let go. He continues to demand retribution for his death.
he cannot let go. And look, I know I've talked about the exquisite artwork in this before, but I think Devos truly is something else. Whoever is drawing her face and expressions in this, my word, take a bow, because they are phenomenal. Like, I'm going to talk about her feelings and motivations because this is an analysis video, but I don't have to at all, because every flicker of emotion is portrayed so elegantly throughout. It's just stunning in my opinion. Basically, I'm a Devos stan now, thanks.
Many souls take eons to ascend.
Yes, but this one seems broken, Thenios. Unlike any soul I have seen. I have begun to wonder whether he was deemed worthy of Bastion. by mistake.
And what Devos is saying here is very important. She's been doing this job for probably billions of years at this point, and yet even though it often takes eons for aspirants to let go of their baggage and ascend, she doesn't think she has ever seen a case like Uther. There's something wrong, something broken about this soul, to the extent that she is starting to wonder if it wasn't a mistake that he was sent to Bastion in the first place. As she talks about him like this, we see him out of focus and fuzzy to emphasize that point before the focus shifts and he is revealed to be clutching at his heart. And as this other blue dude in a helmet basically just dismisses her concerns, is all like, nah, it's fine, trust the purpose.
Be careful, Devos. I would not let the Archon hear such a thought. In time, he will forget. Trust our ways. Trust the path.
And Devos is clearly not convinced, and as we then fade to the next scene, it's almost like we see the first seed of doubt spark in her mind about all of this. And honestly, I don't even know if that bit is intended or not, but I really like it. And as time passes again in this vast, open, free and light paradise, and this very effective image of Devos kneeling down in front of Uther, because up to this point every other character has towered above the Lightbringer. Arthas in victory before executing him, Devos as a heavenly all-powerful being, but we now see how her relationship to him has changed. She has put herself on his level to show the empathy and concern that she is feeling for this most troubled of souls. And it's almost this softening towards Uther that of course eventually helps her to be corrupted by him. Yes, I said it because that's what happens.
And what is keeping me from ascension?
Nothing but the memory of your mortal life.
And in fairness, there is nothing fake about the pain that Uther is feeling. He seems as confused by his inability to let go as Devos is, and when he mentions,
How can I forget when I can still feel his blade?
Devos reaches forward to reveal the open wound from Frostmourne piercing Uther's heart, and the amazement and disgust in Devos's voice here shows how unprecedented this is, and you can see her soft blue eyes flare up with anger and righteousness as she demands,
Your soul is wounded? Who did this to you?
and this is where the great change happens to Devos. Because put yourself in her shoes. Since something like the dawn of time, she has been helping troubled souls shed their burdens and become Kyrion with all of the noble purpose that that involves. Evil doesn't exist here. Every soul that the Sorting Hat, the Arbiter, sends to Bastion is that of a selfless, good person. So no matter the burdens that they carry, their selflessness wins out eventually. They become free of their anger and pain and go on to be literal angels. And then she meets Uther, someone who she is told lived a selfless life, which is true, but doesn't seem to have a trace of that selflessness remaining in Bastion, consumed by the very selfish desire for vengeance. And I know he calls it justice, but he's wrong, as he admits later on. To the extent that Devos actually thought it might be a mistake. He was even sent here. And then she sees that actually he is the victim of the kind of abuse she has never seen in all her time here. A wound in his soul, which is so deep that it has followed him to Bastion. Devos didn't think this was possible. This kind of suffering shouldn't be possible in Bastion, and yet here it is, right in front of her. So she is hit with a combination of shock, concern for Uther and his suffering, but also guilt that she doubted him, thought he was a mistake, when really he was suffering under a burden that she literally couldn't even conceive of. And that guilt she feels, as we will see, makes her overly concerned with righting Uther's wrong, which eventually leads her to doing very much the wrong thing herself.
He was my student. He betrayed us all.
Show me.
Uther's eyes glisten with tears at the rage and hurt that he feels. Devos touches Uther's wound to see the events of his death, and we are back outside Arendelle, and the moment that we were spared at the beginning of this cinematic. In a clear echo of Sylvanas' death at Arthas' hands in her Warbringer episode 2 years ago, anima cascades out of his eyes and mouth in a horrifying way, and as Arthas stands still, cold and emotionless, we see Uther's soul leave his body, and unlike Sylvanas', very clearly split in two. One half cold and blue, and exactly what we'd expect from a doomed soul being imprisoned in Frostmourne, which we know part of Uther is, but another golden half flying off upwards into the sky, and we have to assume Bastion. And which half ends up where is something to speculate on, but I believe that's the way around that this cinematic wants us to think about it, so that's how I'll be talking about it from now on. But either way, it looks like Uther's prayer to the light worked, or at least half worked, and suddenly it makes sense why Devos could see that Uther seemed to be missing something that every other soul she'd ever seen in Bastion always had, because the Uther in Bastion is only half a soul. The Arbiter judged him as living a selfless life, which is true, but because, unbeknownst to her, half of Uther was still in Frostmourne, the part of his soul which arrived in Bastion had the hurt and baggage and the desire for revenge that many aspirants do, but was missing that selflessness that eventually wins out and unburdens itself. We see that part of Uther's soul still in Frostmourne in Wrath of the Lich King, when it appears and shows concern for Jaina and helps her by telling her how to save Azeroth from the Lich King. But the part of Uther that made it to Bastion is only the hurt part, only the part that cries for vengeance dressed as justice, only the part that broods on betrayal. That's what Devos saw without realizing, and why she thought he had been sent to Bastion by mistake. But for now, she's more concerned with the runes that she sees on Frostmourne in this flashback, which she recognizes instantly as being of the Moor, the place that she mentioned earlier where all evil is sealed away, because again, that shouldn't be possible. Nothing from the Moor should be able to escape, let alone find its way into the hand of a mortal on a living world to wreak havoc with. And some people have speculated that Devos is physically infected by Uther's wound here, and you can certainly take that from this drawing. I don't think she is. For me, the moment of change happens before, like I said, and also, I don't think she needs to be physically corrupted. It all works the same anyway, and by showing her all of this, Uther and Arthas and Frostmourne, and by extension the Jailer, have successfully brought a little bit of the Moor into the least Moor-like of all the covenants in Bastion. Just like the Scourge led by Arthas infected and spread their blight around Azeroth, so it has now found its way into actual heaven. More on that. But we then follow Devos to Elysian Hold once again, and her audience with the big boss of the Kyrion, one of the Eternal Ones, the Archon.
The runes on his blade were unmistakable. This dark agent runs free on a mortal world with the power of the Maw itself in hand. Our realm is imperiled.
Impossible.
And I love these opening shots because we've been given so many beautiful shots of Devos' very expressive face, which of course makes her incredibly relatable. But here in the Hold, all of the other Kyrion wear face-obscuring helmets, just like the statues that line the platform. The Kyrion ways are quite literally set in stone. All of the other Kyrion steadfastly follow them, but the helmetless Devos is very clearly the odd one out and different here, as she stands a lone voice against that immovable way.
The path is flawed!
Enough!
The order of the Shadowlands depends on the execution of our eternal charge. You will abandon this course.
And actually, we're going to come back to this scene later, because it will make more sense to talk about it in the context of what happens next. But basically, the Archon tells Devos to forget about the Moor and all that stuff and just get on with it. And she agrees, but clearly doesn't really agree, and she literally turns her back on the Kyrion ways and steps into shadow. A shadow which she then casts over Uther.
The time of your ascension has come.
I thought I was not ready.
Do you wish to see him punished?
I do.
Then prepare yourself.
Blocking the light from shining on the Lightbringer and essentially leading him astray. Just as it could be argued that Uther failed Arthas as a teacher because, Arthas didn't exactly turn out as planned, so Devos is failing Uther as a teacher here by indulging and enabling those worst parts of his broken soul that thirst for vengeance, something she is supposed to help him overcome, but instead, her eyes glowing brightly with rage still, she ascends Uther into a Kyrion when he obviously isn't ready. Still consumed with anger and betrayal because he is only half a soul, don't forget, basically to help her enact her own vigilante justice. And as aspirant Bluther becomes Kyrion Bluther, this shot, which I'm certain is supposed to make us think of Mercy from Overwatch, as Devos reaches out to him, but instead of helping him be free of his burden and pain like she should, she is about to lead him to commit a terrible act in the name of justice, which we already know is revenge.
The moment he falls, we will claim him.
Which of course is the cue for this cinematic to revisit the death of Arthas atop Icecrown. And his final words, again like Uther's, given new context by what we now know to be happening. As the shattered Frostmourn's glow dulls like a broken Terminator's eyes, and don't worry because my Frost DK will be along to collect those in a couple of expansions time, as the iconic Invincible music begins to play and remind us what familiar territory we are on here, and Arthas's human eyes, free from his undead corruption at the last, and as we know from the Wrath ending cinematic, seeing the ghost of his own father right now,
I see only darkness before me.
Takes on a new meaning now that we know about the Moor and how that is darkness incarnate. And Devos swoops down, again inverting the cliche of an angel coming to carry you to a good place, because Arthas is very much not going to the good place, as the swirling vortex of the Moor then erupts out of his eyes in shot and becomes our scene.
Now, cast him into the maw. Return him to the darkness he served. His eternal suffering awaits.
With our two angels significantly with their backs to the light, getting ready to cast Arthas into the depths of Warcraft hell. And yes, this image might look very familiar to you because it brings to mind the Burning of Teldrassil, another moment where a character killed by Arthas sent, in this case a whole city's worth of souls, straight to the Moor and the jailer's clutches. Here it's just the one soul heading that way, but quite a significant one. And with Devos egging him on, Uther has a moment of hesitation.
He was my student.
Remember what he did, and take your vengeance.
Emphasizing the my in he was my student, suggesting that maybe he is starting to feel some responsibility for how things turned out, which would make sense because mere moments ago Frostmourne was shattered, and presumably the other half of Uther's soul, the half with the missing selflessness, compassion and desire for actual justice, might just be starting to find its way back. But Devos, the literal angel, plays the role of the devil at his shoulder and encourages him to go through with an act which, as we will discuss, is possibly the worst thing a Kyrion or anyone else could possibly do, as well as probably being exactly what the jailer wanted and possibly kick-starting all the events that lead us to the Shadowlands. And Devos still recognizes this as what it is: vengeance. She just doesn't care anymore. And as Uther, now the one with the power over the prone, helpless, and almost pathetic looking Arthas, prepares to cast his old charge away to an eternity of suffering, he lies to himself one more time.
Not vengeance. Justice.
Not vengeance, justice. And the last shots of Arthas plummeting into the darkness, and that inversion once again of the angel coming to rescue a soul. Instead, Uther stands, hand outstretched, not in compassion as you would expect from the Lightbringer, but in judgment and execution. And it may be Arthas physically falling into the Moor, but it's these two characters we see on screen right now who have really fallen. As Uther himself says to Arthas in Warcraft 3, vengeance cannot be a part of what we must do. If we allow our passions to turn to bloodlust, then we will become as vile as the orcs. Which, okay, that last bit hasn't aged well, but you get the meaning. And all of this raises some super interesting questions, doesn't it? The first of which is, why did Devos need to make sure that Arthas went to the Moor? Because she could see how evil he was and the atrocities that he committed, and that the jailer's influence was upon him. Wouldn't he have gone to the Moor anyway? For her to feel the need to step in and bypass the Arbiter and deliver him by hand, isn't it fair to conclude that she knew he wouldn't necessarily go there? We know that Revendreth with the Vampire Bitey Boys is basically the last chance saloon for Shadowlands Covenants, where the absolute worst of the worst go who don't go to the Moor. The idea being that you have one last chance in Revendreth to find salvation and hope, and if you do, then you get to become a part of the Shadowlands proper, either becoming a fully fledged Venthyr to help others do the same, or you get moved up to a different part of the Shadowlands altogether. But if you fail, then you get sent to the Moor. And the events of this cinematic make me think that actually no one goes directly to the Moor. And no matter how bad a life you led, you always get that one last chance in Revendreth to save yourself. And yeah, plenty fail and do end up with the jailer, but some do manage to change and redeem themselves and become better, and that's why Devos had to intervene and personally send Arthas to the Moor, because she couldn't take the chance that he would, even if it took eons, eventually save himself, find redemption in Revendreth, and not be damned for eternity. Her own lust for vengeance on Uther's behalf made her bypass the system and the path and the Kyrion ways and deliver Arthas on a plate with a bow on to the jailer. And you know, that's almost certainly what the jailer would have wanted too. Unintentionally, through her disgust that the Moor found a way onto Azeroth and into Arthas, Devos actually plays right into the jailer's hands, because she succumbed to the rage that she felt at Uther's mistreatment, the guilt she felt at her initial ignoring of it, and the betrayal she felt when the Archon and other Kyrians seemingly ignored her very correct warnings about the Moor. Which leads us to the Archon, because it's easy to say, well, if those stupid Kyrion hadn't been so devoted to the path or whatever, then this wouldn't have happened, which may be true. But it's also true that if Devos had done what the Archon told her to, then this wouldn't have happened either. After all, the Archon never says, I don't believe you, or I'm not going to do anything about this. She just says, you shouldn't do anything about this. And she was right, because if Devos had gone back to helping Uther become free of that rage and betrayal and desire for vengeance, like she was supposed to do, then they wouldn't have both succumbed to those poisonous emotions and helped the jailer, and everything that comes after, because by the time we meet Uther and Devos in Bastion next expansion, and obviously a bit of a spoiler here, but they are explicitly working for the jailer. And so Devos' journey and fall echoes that of Arthas, quite interestingly. She is disgusted at discovering a great evil and feels like her comrades turn their back on her concerns and judge that she is going too far. So she takes matters into her own hands and commits a great evil. She would say for the greater good, but that clearly leads to other evil acts, just like it did with Arthas, until eventually she becomes the very thing she claimed to be fighting against. Just as Arthas ended up leading the Scourge to bring ruin to Lordran and other parts of Azeroth, so Devos ends up teaming with the jailer and the Moor. We won't get into the question of what ultimately happens to Uther and Devos in Shadowlands, because that's a story for the expansion itself to tell you. So the last question I have is, what does this mean for Arthas. And I'll tell you one thing. I think it means we're going to see a whole lot more of Arthas in Shadowlands than we may have been expecting. And I know that I, for one, have been quite vocal about my hope that we don't see much of Arthas in this expansion, and especially that we don't see a redemption of him. Because, you know, that's just a bit, isn't it? It's just a bit, But after watching this cinematic, I think that puts a slightly different spin on that. If my theory about Revendreth is true, that no matter how bad you are in life, everyone is entitled to that one last chance among the Venthyr before being sentenced to eternity in the Moor, then that means that Uther has, ironically, robbed Arthas at the chance of redeeming himself that every soul is entitled to. Just like Sylvanas robbed every soul she killed in BFA of that chance and sent them all to the Moor. And if, in repairing the machinery of death, we give Arthas not redemption, but his fair chance at redemption, then that's something I'm totally on board with. Likewise, Sylvanas. If this expansion ends with the jailer defeated and Arthas and Sylvanas, repentant or not, being sent to Revendreth as they should have been, then we don't even need to know for years whether they did achieve redemption or not. The important thing is that it was in their hands and they had their chance, just like everyone should. That would actually make me feel pretty awesome, to be honest. But what do you guys think? Was this cinematic a great start to the series and setup of the events of Bastion in Shadowlands? Did it whet your appetite for the prospect of some hardcore Arthas action in the coming expansion? Did it change the way you feel about Uther? Let us know in the comments below. And of course, we will be doing these analysis videos of all the Afterlives cinematics as they are released weekly, although I can't imagine the other videos be anywhere near as long as this one. There's just quite a lot to process in Bastion, wasn't there? As well as the new weekly reset returning next week. So we look forward to that. But if you like, you can join us on Twitch most days in the meantime to follow all our reactions to stuff as it happens. But until then, thanks for joining us today. If you like this video, don't thank us. Thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to make all of our videos happen. And yes, without you, there really would be a lot less Taliesin and Evitel, so thank you. If you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is Terran Gregory. No, my name is Taliesin from me and Evitel and the Nyrin as well. Until next time, cheerio.